So, how does your faith, what you believe about God, your Christian faith, affect you when you go and work? Well, first off, I want to say that work in the Bible is looked at overwhelmingly throughout it as a good thing. In fact, the very first thing that was given human beings in the book of Genesis, it says the Lord God took the man, this is Adam, and put him in the Garden of Eden to do what? To work it and to protect it, to take care of it. This was not because of sin. Sin had not yet happened, okay? This was the good old days, okay? And so work is viewed throughout the Bible as a good thing. Even if sin, it would never have happened, I think, which you can't really ever imagine that, but even if people had never sinned, they'd still be working. Somehow we have this negative aspect that sometimes we think of work as a punishment for sin, but that's not true. Work gives us happiness. Work gives you purpose in doing something that you feel is productive in your life is a big thing to who you are as a person. A feeling of self and a feeling of worth comes from sometimes part of who you are as a working individual. Now, how does this affect your faith, affect how you work and what you think about work? And that's what I want to talk about. There was a guy, Tim Keller, who used to be pastor in Hopewell, and then he moved to New York and started a church there, and he was very successful. He just recently passed away in the last couple of years, but he wrote a great book on work. And in the book, he talks about being in New York. His church was in the city, and he had this, the name of it was Redeemer Church, and he had this actor that started coming to his church. And the actor was on a TV show, pretty much. He was on, you could watch him every week almost. I don't know what his name was, but he says this actor came to him and said, I really recently listened to your message and I've accepted Christ and I've been coming to a discipleship class and I'm learning more about the Bible, but I have some questions about how I live out my new faith in my job. And so Dr. Keller said, what kind of questions? He said, well, there are two kinds. First of all, he said, what kind of programs should I act in? I mean, should they be, programs that, are have happy endings? And Keller thought for a moment. He said, well, probably not. He said, well, why not? Well, you look at the book of Judges. There's lots of stories in the Bible that don't have happy endings. And say, okay, I didn't think about that. And then he had another kind of question. The question was, he said, American actors are taught a way of acting called method acting. And method acting means that if you're going to play somebody who's angry, you actually need to get angry. And if you play somebody who is like mean and judgmental, you have to think mean and judgmental thoughts, where British actors don't really do that. And Keller said, well, nobody's ever asked me that before. That is something to think about. And he said, that drove me to thinking more about how your faith should impact your work. Now, none of us are actors that I know about, professional actors, but a lot of us have jobs. And how do we live out our belief system at work so that, we're living like Jesus wants us to live? So I got 5 things to say about that. Actually 4, I think. Here we go. First one. Your faith determines your identity, not your work. What do I mean by that? Often, people get identified with what they do for a living. Guys meet each other. One of the first things people say is, oh, what do you do? What do you do? And sometimes that label determines who you are. I was out somewhere in the community. I think I was in I forget the neighborhood over here where Williamsburg National anyway, and I was talking to some people there, and one of the guys pointed out to me this guy in the hat. He said that guy in the hat. I said, yeah. He said, he's a pediatric surgeon. I said, oh, okay. A few seconds later, I was talking to another person. He said, by the way, the guy in the hat? Yeah, he's a doctor. And I got to thinking, we get these labels of who we are. And I don't know necessarily that's good, is if somebody only sees you as whatever it is you do in your work. Because if you're successful, it can go to your head and you could think, wow, I'm successful, so I'm smart about everything. And if you're not successful, you feel like a loser about everything. And so this idea that getting your identity, whatever it might be, from your job is not the best way to get your identity if you're a Christian. I gave you an example. There's this woman, and she was in a discussion with a pastor, and she's talking about this, and she said, I was thinking about it. In my life, I've had 5 different identities. And he said, what do you mean? She said, well, when I was growing up, I was a young girl. I went to a conservative church, a fundamentalist church, and I felt good about myself. I was very, very moral. I did everything they told me to do. I thought I was one of the good people, and the pastor said, well, what happened? He said, well, after a while, it was really hard. And I felt like I wasn't living up to it, and I found myself very judgmental. And so when I went to college, I broke away from my faith. And so I left that, identity, and I started dating people in a romantic relationships. And she said, these often were intense, and I got my identity from who I was dating. And if I was dating somebody that was good looking or successful, it made me feel good about myself. And so that's where I got there was a song by Frank Sinatra. You ever heard this song? You're nobody till somebody loves you. I'm not going to sing it, but you're nobody till somebody loves you. It's a great song. And it says you could be a king, you could have all the gold in the world, but if nobody loves you, you don't have anything. What's the problem with that? She went through bumps in her relationships. And so these people that she'd invested in, these boyfriends, she stayed with them longer than she needed to. Sometimes they were mean to her and she didn't break up with them because that's where she got her identity. So that was the second one. Then she got her identity. She had some girlfriends that said, listen, girl, you need to get liberated. You don't need to be dependent on any man. Get you a job, get you a career. And so that's what she did. She finished her education. She got her a job as a successful businesswoman, and she was doing well at that. And this is where I'm saying don't always get your identity from work, because when she got a bump at work and she kind of took a step backwards, her career, she felt lost because her identity was all on her career. And if she wasn't successful, she felt terrible. And so after that happened, she got her 4th identity. Somebody said, well, honey, you need to do something for other people because you're always doing for yourself is not good. And so she started doing stuff for others. She volunteered and she started helping people. And she did that a bunch. And then she got burned out because she was always doing for other people. And so she went through this, and this is her quote as what she said before she got to her last one. She said, first I thought I was somebody because I was moral. Then I thought I was somebody because I was beautiful. Then I thought I was somebody because I was successful. Then I thought I was somebody because I was helpful. And the pastor said, well, what happened? She said, well, I finally heard the gospel. And I realized I've been trying to save myself. You see, the gospel says that God loves me, not because of what I do or somebody else does for me, not because of my own success, but because what Jesus has done for me. In Romans 8, Paul says this, the Spirit that you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received, you didn't earn it, brought about your adoption to sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Remember when Jesus was baptized and he came out of the water? What's the first thing the Holy Spirit said to him? Or God said to him, this is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. And when you accept Christ and make him your Lord and Savior, your identity comes from God. It's not based on your work. It's not based on your, being a success. It's based on Jesus, who has given you new life and adopted you into his family. So that's a great way your faith affects your work. Second, your faith teaches you that there is dignity in all work. We live in a culture today where it kind of teaches you the more money you make, the more successful you are as a person. And you may be on Facebook and they come up with a list of the most, the jobs that make the most money. And you look at it and you think, well, my job is way down there. That must mean I'm not as good a person. No, that's not what the Bible teaches. In Psalms 136:25, it says, God gives food to every creature. His love endures forever. Now, the idea there, and Martin Luther years ago said this about that. He said, God gives the food to feed everything, but how does God do it? It just doesn't magically appear on your plate. Somebody has to plant the crops, grow them. Some farmer has to produce the corn or whatever it might be, and then somebody else has to pick it, somebody else has to take it to the market, somebody else has to prepare it, somebody else has to package it, somebody else has to drive it to the supermarket, all those things. And you say, well, those aren't important jobs. Yes, they are. You're doing what God has called us to do. If you're part of helping people do the things that need to happen so that we can survive. There's another verse in Psalm 147:13 says, God strengthens the bars of your gates and blesses your people within you. Well, he's talking about security there. If you work in some field where you're providing, like a police officer or a fireman or some kind of first responder, it's very much doing what the Lord has called you to do. It doesn't matter how much money it makes. There's a lot of jobs in our culture that don't pay very well, including teaching. Is that important? Very much. And so to understand that we don't look at things the way people look at things, that we look at what God looks at, and God blesses work. And if you do a good job, whether it's sweeping the floors or being a janitor or working at McDonald's or being a pediatric surgeon, all those are important jobs. All those are necessary. And there's honor and value in all those, dignity in all of them. Third way, your faith teaches you about what you work. Your faith teaches you a Christian should do their job well. I mean, that seems self-evident, but this idea, somebody might call it a ministry of competence. You don't have to work as a pastor to be called to do a good job. For instance, if you were a pilot, let's say you were a pilot for Delta. If you want to be a Christian pilot for Delta, how do you do that? Does that mean that you walk up and down the aisle in the plane and hand out tracts before you take off? Not necessarily. You know what it means? It means that you land the plane. It means that you fly the plane well. You're there early to fly it. You know how to fly it. You do all the training. You walk around the plane, do all the steps that you're supposed to do. You take off well. You fly the plane well. You land smoothly so that the plane can take off again. That's being a Christian in your job. You have this ministry of competence. All of us should be responsible. If you want to be a good witness of what it means to be a Christian, do your job really well. Proverbs talks in many places about those that don't. Proverbs 24 says this. This is very practical. I went past the field of a sluggard, somebody who was lazy, past the vineyard of someone who had no sense. And thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds. The stone wall was in ruins. And I applied my heart to what I observed, and I learned a lesson from what I saw. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a thief, and scarcity like an armed man. So one of the things that your faith should teach you about work, it teach you about the dignity about all work and that you don't get your identity from work, but also that you should do a good job if you're a Christian. You should be on time, you should be faithful, you should be dependable, you should respond when people text you or email you or call you. You should be a great example of what it means to be the best worker you can be. 4, another way your Christian faith impacts the way you work is your faith provides a moral compass for your work. We live in a culture that often forgets its moral compass. I think of several years ago when we had remember when we had everybody getting loans for houses that really didn't deserve it, and they were giving out money, and it eventually had this huge crisis where the mortgage loan crisis and banks were failing, and we had to bail them out. And why did that happen? Well, there's lots of stuff you can read about. One of the things I was reading about is that for years, they didn't have laws about everything, but there was a sense of this is the right way to behave in the finance industry. There was this concept that, yes, we do that, but we don't do that. But it wasn't written down clearly. And so what happened? That went away. And people started doing whatever they could get away with. Whatever they could get away with, that's what they do. And it all came crashing down. They were trying to make a profit. But, the Bible is clear about a lot of things. For instance, in the 10 Commandments, it says, you shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. So you shouldn't lie. And you shouldn't steal. That's pretty clear. And, you say, well, that's self-evident. Well, no, sometimes people forget that when they're at work. When I was a young person, I had a job at JCPenney Outlet in Forest Park, which Jeff knows where it is. And I was working there, and I worked in sporting goods, but I had a buddy that worked on the loading dock. And we were about the same age, 21, 22 years old, really young. And it turned out that when my buddy was hired, there were these people that worked on the loading dock, young guys, who were stealing stuff. They were stealing TVs and other things at the loading dock, and they had a system. Well, they didn't know that there were cameras watching everything. And so when my buddy was hired, he was a Christian. He went to church, every Sunday, and I know he was a good guy, but he was timid. And even though he saw it happening, he said nothing. And that's really the same as stealing, because to see somebody else do it and not say something is wrong. And so they all got caught, and he was fired, and it scarred him, because he didn't allow his Christian faith, which he had learned, and he was young, we all make mistakes, to influence his job at work. It's clear, though, that the Bible teaches you shouldn't lie, you don't steal, and Jesus said this, the greatest commandment, the second part of it is love your neighbor as yourself. There's no greater commandment than these. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. This principle that you treat other people as you want them to treat you. How much would work so much better You know, if you went to a mechanic and the mechanic never did anything to your car he wouldn't do to his own car. Never would, treat you any different than he'd want somebody else to treat him. What a different world we would live in. And that's so important. 5. Your faith provides the hope for work that will never be finished. And maybe this is even more important for those of us as we get older. Sometimes you look back and you say, well, what difference have I really made? One day I'm going to, cease being a pastor, and somebody's going to say, well, he's a good pastor. Now we got to get another one. And that's it. And you wonder, wow, what did I accomplish? What did I accomplish? There is a really interesting short story. There was a guy named J.R. Tolkien. He wrote Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and this trilogy. And he spent his whole career, while one of his best friends was C.S. Lewis, who wrote book after book after book. But Tolkien worked on one book his whole career. And there was a time when he was working on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and he had writer's block, and he couldn't write anything, and it went on and on. And one night he had this dream, and he woke up the next day, and he wrote the dream down into a short story, and the short story is called Leaf by Niggle, okay? The name of the story is Leaf by Niggle. Now, to understand this, the story is about a man named Niggle, and it's an allegory, okay? Niggle in the British language means someone who wastes time a lot. They call it niggling. If you waste time, And this guy wasted time. He was an artist, and his dream was to paint this huge painting, and he put this huge canvas on the side of a building of one, maybe it was a library in the little town that he lived, and he spent years working on this painting, and the painting was supposed to be of this beautiful tree with a great sunset and looked like paradise. Okay, but he would work on it, and then he would be called aside to help somebody else. There was this guy that was his neighbor. His neighbor's name was Parrish, and he was always saying, "Help me with my garden." And so Nigel Niggle would get distracted, and it came to the end of his life, and all he'd painted was one leaf. That's it. And they come to get him, to take him to heaven. And he said, well, I'm not ready to go. I got to do all this. And they said, too late. You got to go. And after he left, they tear down all of his work except for the one leaf. And they put it in a museum because the leaf was terrific. It was terrific. But the story goes that it's longer than what I'm saying, but he goes on this journey. He's going to heaven, and he's on the foothills going toward heaven, and I think he's in a train, and he sees something, and they stop the train, and he gets out of the train, and he walks in these foothills, and he comes into this beautiful forest, and guess what he sees? He sees his tree. The tree that he had an image of, that he wanted to draw, and he sees the background, and everything looks just like it was, and Parrish, this guy that was his neighbor, shows up, and they spend their time working on that part of heaven and making it completed. And the idea of the story, I think, is that yes, you may not complete what you want to on earth, but God gives us the hope that even in death, what we are given as a vision will be completed. Because I think even when we get to heaven, it's just not going to be us laying on a cloud, singing hymns. We go back to what God gave Adam and Eve. You're to work the garden. And so we'll be given new tasks. And I think those tasks will be linked to what our tasks were now. And so don't ever think that what you're doing is meaningless. Even if it's just a little leaf that you finish, it makes a big deal. Last thing I want to say, several years ago, there was an article about the Queen that has passed away recently, but the Queen made it her practice to walk around Scotland to this neighborhood where she was from every year, and she loved the people there, and she would often talk to people, and sometimes she'd even go without a protective escort. This is a long time ago. And one afternoon, she kind of got turned around, and she walked further than she expected, and dark clouds came up, and she stopped by a nearby house to borrow an umbrella because she needed one. It was raining. And the lady met her at the door, but the lady didn't know who it was. She didn't recognize that she was the Queen of England. And so she was afraid to give her a nice umbrella, so she had an old, worn-out umbrella that had hole in it and was bent. One of the things was bent on it. And she gave that to her because she's afraid she wouldn't get it back. The next day, there was a knock at the door. The lady opened it, and she was greeted by one of the royal guard, and holding in her hand this old, tattered umbrella she had given the Queen. And the man said, the royal guard said, "The Queen sent me, and she asked me to thank you for loaning her this." And the lady thought, what have I done? I gave her the worst, and she was the Queen. God has given us life. We're to do the best we can with it. We're to be people who take our faith and the jobs that God gives us and to do them with everything that we can, to be honest and to be hard workers and to get our identity not from our jobs but from God, and to have that kind of faith. And I'm praying that as we go through this next week, I pray that you take some of this and maybe you think about it. What is your leaf? I don't know. But I pray that you do it well.